Hi, and welcome to another Android Developer Lab Plus for the 13th of December 2012. It is actually our final ADL Plus for the year, so I hope you're excited because we're talking about a new API that we've recently launched. And let me first introduce our special guest. Welcome, Paul Saxman. Paul, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Paul Saxman. I'm a developer advocate on the Google Maps team, and so I work, or will be working more on the Android APIs and some of our other APIs that we recently announced that I won't talk about, but we will be talking about in the next couple of weeks. So, and yeah, so we're really excited to be here and to kind of talk about a little more about what's going on in the Android map. What is it? The Google Maps Android API.
V2.
V2.
Yes. So, well, it's really good to have you, so thank you for joining us today. And we have our usual regular, Tony Chan.
Yeah, hello everyone.
Joining us from Hong Kong, as usual. So today I'm Anchor Cotwell, and I'm joining you from Mountain View, California this week. Yeah, we're just waiting to get started. So let's, with that being said, let's get started with the presentation. Just sharing my slides, and here we are. So, as usual, first we'll start off with what's been happening recently in terms of news. We launched an Android developer survey very recently, and basically we're asking Android developers to give us feedback on a whole range of topics. It takes probably anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes, depending on how long you spend on it. But it's really valuable information to us, and we want to hear what your experience is like. So please do let us know. The survey is closing fairly soon, and yeah, it helps us prioritize the work that we do. It helps us prioritize, go to the engineering teams and tell us that these are the important things that that developers are asking for. And so more data points is always a good thing. In other news, we've recently launched Google Play Services version 2. So if you remember back to about 2 months ago, we launched version 1, which had the OAuth 2 component as well as the Google Plus API. Well, now we have version 2, and it includes the Google Maps Android API version 2 as well, which explains why Paul is here. So there's tons of great things about it. For starters, we get vector-based maps, so we're able to retain graphical fidelity regardless of what zoom level you're at. We have beautiful 3D cameras, 3D camera control now, so not just your zoom and rotate, but tilt as well. And you'll get 3D buildings popping up in cities that support them. It includes support for indoor maps, and of course, everything that developers have been asking for a while, which is map fragments. So, you know, we're not going to, well, hopefully we're not going to see any questions now saying when can we use maps on tablets, because they're finally here. Google Play Services version 2 also included a Photosphere API. So Photosphere is a new feature on Android 4.2, which basically allows you to capture a 360-degree panorama. They're really beautiful. There's some great ones up there on Google+, so go hunting for them. They're worth looking at. And so obviously we have some APIs around that too. And next up is in-app billing. So one of the things that developers have been asking for with in-app billing is being able to have a synchronous way of doing it. So in the past with in-app billing version 1 and 2, what would happen is you'd send off a purchase request and it would get back to you at some point later. Whereas now it won't return to you until, as soon as you ask for it, you'll get a response. So you'll basically wait for a response. So this really simplifies coding around the API. It makes it a lot more reliable as well. And you know, there's a ton of new functionality there as well, including local caching and something again developers have been asking for, which is being able to query for product info. So now with this API, you can actually query at runtime to say what are the in-app purchases available, what are their prices, and what are their description. So you no longer need to hard code those prices in your app, which is just great news both for developers but also for users. The thing that's missing in in-app billing version 3 at the moment is subscription, but that's coming very soon. and it's we basically expect developers to start using version 3 as soon as possible, because it really is great. So with that being said, I'm now going to hand it over to Tony to talk to us about the Maps API. So Tony.
Yeah, thanks. So let's get started. So before we get into the details, let me give a brief introduction on how to get started to incorporate the new Maps API into your Android apps. So the first thing you need to have is, of course, like installing the Google Play services. It's included in the part of the Android SDK Manager. So if you go to Eclipse and launch the SDK Manager, you will see a new version of Google Play services, which is version 2, and just install it. That's the first step. Next slide. The next thing you need to have is, of course, just like the first version, you need to have a Google Maps API key. So one thing which is really important is the existing key you have from if you already have a Maps an application using the Map View version 1. One thing important is the key for version 1 is not going to work with the version 2 API. So you do need to generate a new Maps API key to use the new version. Another thing about the API key is it's generated in the Google API console. So pay attention, that's not the Google Play Developer Console. So I actually include a screenshot of what the Google API console looks like. You can go to this console by going to code.google.com/apis/console. So one thing you will notice now under the All Services, if you already have a Google project, you will see the Google Maps API version 2 services available now. You can click into that and to generate new keys. Next slide. So about the Maps API key, the format is like you have is the first part of the so you need two things to generate the Maps API key. The key itself is a 40-character key, but in order to generate the key, you need to have two things. One is your app certificate's SHA-1 fingerprint, and the next thing is the package name. So so how to get the SHA-1 fingerprint? So you can use the key tool command line. I have included command line here. But one thing you really need to pay attention is you need to use the -v verbose attribute so that it will show the SHA-1 fingerprint. So one thing is if you don't include the -v parameter, by default, the fingerprint shown on the result is going to be MD5 fingerprint, which looks almost exactly like the SHA-1 fingerprint. So we have some developer try to run the key tools, and then they said it couldn't generate the key because it's the wrong fingerprint. In this case, we need the SHA-1 fingerprint instead of the MD5 one. Another best practice I want to share with you is it's a good practice to use a different certificate to sign each application. So in this case, you will use your application certificate to get the SHA-1 fingerprint, and then we append the package name after a colon. And you will generate the right Maps API key. Next slide. So another thing you need to make sure to include in your project is, especially if you want to target anything earlier than API 11. So in most cases, I think the support library is really important. So the new Maps API also backport to the support library, and so you need to install the latest support library. Instead of using the map fragment, if you use the support library, use support map fragment. Next slide. So now let's talk about how to add after you generate the maps API key, how to include that in your application. So at the end of, if you go to your Android manifest.xml, you need to add a metadata tag with the name com.android, com.google android.maps v2 API key, and then you paste your newly generated API key to the value attribute. You also need to create a custom permission to include that in your Android manifest. The permission name is your package name .permission.maps _ receive. So I already include all the details in the slide. So that's the a special custom permission you need. You also need some other permission. Next slides. So here are a couple of permissions you most likely will need. The first one is the internet connection. So we need that to download the Google the map tiles from our Google Map server. You also need to include the right external storage permission to take advantage of the caching for maps. Another read Google services permissions. That's a permission we need to access all the Google web-based services. There are a couple optional, but most likely very useful for most of the maps application is you probably need access the course location and find location if you plan to get access to the user current location.
So I just want to emphasize a point here that Tony made. The access course and find location are truly optional. Don't just blindly include them just because you're using the library, because often you'll have a map in your app and you're not actually using the user's location. I've written many apps using this new API where I didn't need these permissions. So it's really important that people don't just blindly copy and paste and include. I mean, we've had a previous presentation on abusing permissions. So yeah, don't be overzealous with them.
Yep, thanks, Tinker. So the next things you need to include in the manifest is to include the feature OpenGL ES version 2. As Anchor mentioned earlier, the new maps are using vector-based maps, and that's actually a requirement to have OpenGL ES version 2. So I'm sure you guys will enjoy to try out the new API, and so one small favor we need to ask you guys to include is an attribution requirement in order to use the new Maps API. So you can add that as a separate action item or as part of your original or your own about action item in your application. We make it even easier for you. So there is API call from Google Play Services to get the open source software license info. So you just need to grab that text from that method and just include that in your about us action item.
Just also want to add here that as of the 1st of October, 90% of Android devices support OpenGL 2 version 2. So anything remotely modern will definitely do it, but in terms of older devices that don't support OpenGL version 2, we're talking about 9.2%. So the majority of devices definitely will support this. It's not such a hard requirement because you definitely get better maps, and the experience on device wouldn't be worthwhile anyway. So this isn't as strict a requirement as it may seem.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Anchor. So that's pretty much all I have for getting started to have your apps to incorporate the maps, and I'll pass it to Paul to tell you guys more details about how to all the features in the maps in the new Maps API. Paul.
Cool. Yep. Thanks, Tony. So so Tony took you through all the steps to get kind of prepped for including a map, and now I'll kind of start off with telling you actually how to get the map in your application from the code point of view. So first thing is you definitely want to set up a layout, to actually hold the map, and that layout actually is the layout component is a fragment, or you can use a fragment for that. So in the first sample here, we're using the support map fragment because we're using the support library. But you can, if you're not using the support library, which you probably should be using the support library, but just leave support out of that, the support map fragment line there at the end.
So basically, if you're supporting devices prior to Honeycomb Android 3.0, you'll be using the support library because we didn't have fragments prior to that. Now, given that Gingerbread, which is 2.3, is still roughly about 50% of the user base, you almost definitely will be using the support library. So this is an important point.
Yep. Yeah. So we'll kind of carry on with under the assumption that you're using the support map fragment, but I mean the code essentially looks exactly the same, or
different namespaces.
Exactly, different namespaces and slightly different function calls. But yeah. And you can see so when we're actually creating our activity. You using the support library, you define it as a fragment activity. And maybe Ankur, what is the fragment activity? Why isn't it not just called fragment or?
Well, so in Android 3.0 and upwards, activities could host fragments. Now fragments are part of the lifecycle as well. Now prior to Android 3.0, you just had, because there were no fragments, those activities don't support the fragment lifecycle. So in the support library, we introduced a fragment activity, which extends activity, but it adds the calls in for the fragment lifecycles, and that it can host fragments. So that's why we're using this particular. That's why we're using the fragment activity here.
Very cool. And yep. So from then on out, it's just a matter of getting the map in your activity or your fragment. So it's called the Google Map is the class name, and you can see in the onCreate method is actually where you're going to get it out of your layout file, just using the ID that you specified in your layout. So and I should mention, so the activity main is the activity main.xml file for the layout I defined up above. So so that's pretty much it to get a map in your activity, so or activity or fragment. So with this actually. With this code here, I'd have a map that was basically the entire view. But that fragment, obviously, you can put anywhere in your view hierarchy. So you could embed it, below some buttons or in a modifiable pane, that type of thing.
And now you can actually have more than one.
Oh yeah.
So for all those developers that have been asking for a fragment, for map fragments, we want to see these apps that use more than one map at a time.
Yeah.
Because I think it'll be interesting to see what kind of experience you provide there. Keep in mind that most of these typically maps allow you to pan as well. So if you've got swipe gestures and so on, like if you're using a view pager, that introduces an interesting dynamic, because the view pager itself can swipe across pages, but if you're hosting a map, it's going to consume those swipe events.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, just keep these sorts of things in mind. You can do tricks like with the view pager, because you can just press on the tab at the top to go to the next page. You can kind of get away with it, but if you've got a bunch of pages where you're swiping left or right to go through them, and suddenly there's a map in there, it's going to seem inconsistent to users where they're being able to swipe across pages. Sometimes you've just got a static map, in which case it doesn't move, so you can just allow the swipes. But if it's consuming it, just pay attention to the user experience.
All right. Yeah, and if you really want to see multiple maps in an app at the same time, definitely check out the sample application, the demo app that's part of the SDK tools. So that actually will, I think there's one sample in there that has 4 maps in a single view, and they're all, all the events are being handled independently. Pretty cool stuff. So couple of really important things. So I'm just going to cover two kind of high-level concepts or kind of important map concepts, and these are kind of the basic use cases. One is the camera. So that's actually, kind of your viewport into the map, or what part of the map that you're actually looking at. And the other is markers. Markers are very fundamental to generally, or for most mapping applications. So camera and markers are what we're going to cover today. There's obviously a lot more features to the API that we can cover in a later show. Things like polylines and polygons and ground overlays and that type of thing. So
I just have a question for you, Paul. For someone that doesn't know, what would you define as a marker? What does that mean?
So, well, we'll cover that in just a second. I have
Sure.
an image of that. So marker just fundamentally is just like if you want to put a marker or a pin on the map as to where somebody or something is. So the iconic marker that we use for Google Maps is kind of the inverted teardrop. It looks like the inverted red teardrop.
So it's sort of like in a fixed location, something
Yep.
that sits on the map. Okay, cool.
Exactly.
Oh,
Well, not necessarily fixed. I mean, you can move them around if you really want to, and it's actually relatively easy to move around. But yeah, we'll cover a few of these in a
Cool.
minute, and
Sure.
you'll see what they look like. So in terms of the camera, the key concepts with camera is obviously the camera location. That's actually where the camera is positioned over top the map. And that can actually take two forms. It's lat long, so you can actually center it on a certain point of the map, or the view of the map. And then the other one is bounds, and that takes two lat long objects. So you can say, I want the map centered at this point, or I want a certain area of the map to be just viewable in the display. And you do that via the bounds.
And so it'll zoom to cover those bounds, basically. Zoom out to cover those, or zoom in to cover those.
Exactly. Bounds. So let's say if you want to actually show a neighborhood, and you know the top left and bottom right coordinates for that neighborhood in terms of geographic terms, you just say I want to have this bounds or this bounding box actually displayed on my map, and the map will actually resume and position itself to actually display the entire bounding area. Cool. So very useful if you wanted to display an area as opposed to display a particular point. Displaying a particular point is you just need the lat long. Zoom is actually essentially how high the camera is over the map. Yeah, I mean it's fairly fundamental, but it's kind of analogous to altitude, except that it's inverted. So 0 is actually zoomed all the way out, and as you zoom in, you don't necessarily, like if you're at zoom 0, you won't necessarily get the entire map. Zoom 0 just says that I'm going to go as far out as the viewport allows me to. So if you have a very big screen, I haven't tried it on let's say like a Nexus 10, but presumably if you're zoomed all the way out on a Nexus 10, you'll actually see the entire map of the world. On a smaller device, you'll probably actually see a fraction of the map. I think it's like you'll see the entire map if it's like 256 dp. Size. So bearing. So now that we have vector-based maps and you can actually rotate them, which is a really cool effect. Bearing is actually the kind of the rotation of the map.
Mm-hmm.
So it actually rotates clockwise. So bearing 0 is north is at the top of your interface, and as you rotate the bearing, actually the map rotates clockwise, and you go all the way up to 360, and then you're back to north. So 90 degrees, I think, is north on the right-hand side of the interface. Tilt, again, this is a nice feature of a nice feature of the vector-based maps is actually you can look at it at an angle, so you don't have to look at the map exactly, straight down.
Top down.
You can actually specify a tilt between 0. 0 is actually top down, and somewhere between like 45 and 90 degrees. So
yeah, it depends on your zoom level as to how much tilt you can have, right?
Exactly. So 45 is actually, if you're looking at a map at 45, you can definitely see that there's an angle there. If you actually bring it below 45, you start to see some kind of 3D effects. It'll be like kind of a little bit of kind of fogging at the further end and that type of thing. So really great effect if you're like doing like moving through the map to have some kind of tilt on the map. Scrolling is actually just moving, programmatically moving the position of the map. And animation is a really important topic too, because when you're actually repositioning the map, you can either do it instantaneously. So let's say I want to move from New York to San Francisco. I can have the map just display, at one moment display New York, and then when I send the command, actually have it display San Francisco. Also, you could actually have that camera change animated, so you can actually fly over the United States to go from New York to San Francisco. Really nice effect for kind of more advanced use cases. General use case obviously would be to reposition the map.
So I'll just add that these capabilities of zoom, rotation or bearing, tilt, and scrolling, when you add the map yourself, when you add the map fragment, the typical touch controls come with it. So by default, they're enabled. So users can swipe to to pan around. For those of you that don't know, we have 2-finger gestures for rotation, where you hold one finger steady and rotate your other finger around that steady finger. Tilt is 2 fingers up and down, and well, scrolling is scrolling. There's also a trick for zoom. Obviously, there's the sort of pinching in your fingers and pinching out, but we've actually got a one-handed gesture as well, where you can double tap, but on the second tap, you actually hold it down and drag up and down, and it zooms out. So you get this really nice. When you've got something like a phone in your hand, you can zoom on these maps without having to put these gestures in. The reason it's important for developers to know this is that it comes for free with the map fragment. You don't need to implement it yourself. You can override it and disable it if you want, though.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, all these events. So actually, when we get to markers, I'll cover a few of the events that you receive on markers. But yeah, you do actually get a lot of these events. You can't override all of them, but a lot of them are available for overriding as well. So, but yeah, that double tap and hold to zoom is definitely a lifesaver. A lot of times.
You're not using it while you're driving or anything, right, Paul?
No. Yeah, but it's really good. If you want to, because these are vector maps, you can zoom to any level. I mean, it's actually a continuous zooming scale. So. So unlike like tile-based or raster-based mapping, where you tend to do it at discrete levels, so having the ability to actually kind of just slide and zoom is really nice from a user's perspective. And the last thing that we'll talk about a little bit, positioning versus updating of the camera. Positioning. Just lost the lights in here. There we go. So positioning is actually moving the camera, and that's actually you specify all of the, so between location, zoom, bearing, and tilt, whichever ones you want to specify of those 4, and you change the camera position. All the other ones are actually defaulted. So if I say move to New York, and I just pass the lat longs to New York, it'll go to default zoom level, default bearing, tilt, etc. And that's actually really great for positioning is kind of the default way to actually move the view around the map. Updating, on the other hand, camera updating is you're just changing a particular attribute. So for example, location. So this is where scrolling comes in. Is if I want to scroll the viewport left or right, or I want to actually zoom in like one level or zoom out one level. These are just updates. I'm not actually changing the entire camera position. So position is for actually, starting from scratch and changing the viewport or where the camera is positioned over the map. And updating is actually just incrementally changing. So.
And updating also animates to the destination, right?
You can or can't. So animation is something that you essentially turn on or off. So show a little bit, I think, in the next slide where we have a little bit of code. Yeah, so yeah, actually I left the animate out of this one, but I think I have it in a later slide. So in terms of position, camera position, so bearing and tilt are actually only available in position. So bearing and tilt aren't available in updates. I'm not exactly sure why we didn't include them in updates. Probably because of the primary use cases of positioning, but you can see here there's in this camera position builder, this is more or less like a factory object. I can actually specify the target, zoom, bearing, and tilt. Zoom, bearing, and tilt are all optional. So if you just want to reposition, like I said, at default zoom, bearing, and tilt levels. You just specify the target, and the map will kind of start over again at that location. The zoom, bearing, and tilt you can optionally set to get a particular effect.
I'm a bit of a fan of the fact that these methods all return the same object back, so that you can chain them in this nice way. Without having a ton of verbose code that, states your same object over and over again.
Yeah, this is a really nice feature of this builder, is that you just kind of build these things up and fire them away. So once you have this new camera position, you just pass it to the camera update factory, get your camera update object out, and then you just do map.move camera. And the other one, what is it called? I'm going to just go to the, oh yeah, I just cheated right there. So the other one...
nobody saw it, though. It's not like this is recorded or anything.
No, of course not. Nobody noticed that 10-frame slide switch that I just did. So yeah, so map.move camera, you just pass the updated camera, or the camera update, map.animate. Oh geez, I forgot already. Animate camera. Will actually animate the transition. So once you have this camera update object, you can make a decision about how you want to do the transition. So camera update, on the other hand, is a little bit different. So we're going directly to that camera update class. So we're not actually using the camera position class. So here we have a camera update factory. I have to specify the or I can specify the lat long. Like I said before, and that's for the center of the map. I can also do like a lat long zoom here, where I specify a new lat long and zoom level, and then I can also do the bounds here as well. So if I want to basically like zoom out to show a neighborhood, or zoom in to show like a particular area of the city, these are very convenient functions for doing that. So scrolling is actually part of the camera update class as well. So scrolling and zoom, I mean, the primary use cases I see for these two, as opposed to using camera position, is for if you want to actually do your own map controls. Let's say you want to provide your own zoom buttons, or you want to actually provide your own panning buttons. These are really nice a nice class to use. Another use case is, let's say you're animating a sprite on the map. Let's say he's walking across the map to show directions to the grocery store. I mean, you can actually use the scrolling object or the scrolling method to actually scroll the change. So, and again, these are actually animated or not animated. So, interesting thing about zoom is you can actually do zoom in, zoom out, zoom by a certain percentage, or zoom to one of the discrete levels. Markers. So we'll kind of talk about these real quick. So markers. So positioning markers is obviously very important, because markers actually show a particular location, geolocation on the map. Info windows, this is information that's related to a position or a marker that you can display. Dragging is actually, you can allow users to move the marker around the map if they want to. This is a little bit of an advanced thing, but it's actually really easy to do. Icons, so there's obviously default marker icon, which I said before is kind of that inverted teardrop. But you can actually customize it. You can actually, well, actually I have this a little bit wrong. So customizing is actually part of info windows that we'll talk about later. But icons you can actually customize by doing specifying unique colors, specifying your images or bitmaps, and specifying how they anchor on the map. And then there's events on markers as well. So in terms of positioning, info windows, and dragging, really easy to do. I mean, this is a huge update from the last from the map view 1.0. Is that position? You just basically you add a marker to your map. You specify your marker options, and then you set whatever properties you want. Position is you absolutely have to have a position. If you don't have a position for your marker and you try to place it on the map, you're going to get an exception. Title, snippet, and draggable are all optional. So if you specify title and or snippet, actually you'll get an info window. So on the right-hand side, the red inverted teardrop is actually the marker to show where the position is, the lat long coordinates are, and the the title and snippet show up in the info window. So so by default, info windows are off. You can actually turn them on. I think it's actually marker.show info window. That will actually programmatically display the info window. And there's also, I believe, a hide method as well. So if you want to programmatically hide it, so by default they're off. By default, if the user, if you specify title or snippet and the user touches the marker, you'll see the info window. Draggable is a neat thing. You have to see it to understand exactly what it does. But if a user long presses, the default behavior is that if a user long presses a marker and the marker is draggable, which you specify with this draggable true, the marker actually becomes repositionable by the user. So this is a really great use case if you want the user to, let's say, you want to actually get feedback from the user about the location of something. So in terms of the icons or the images, so all this is actually access to this marker options, or you specify marker images or colors, images, and anchoring via the marker options class. So as I said before, position has to be in all these. So all these actually show position here. So the first thing is that you can pretty easily change the color. This is using this bitmap descriptor factory, and you actually just specify the hue. You can use one of our pre-canned hues. Can't remember exactly how many of them there are, but there's a fair number of pretty appealing colors. And or you can actually specify the hue using a float. You can specify your own image. The easiest way to get the image in there is having it in your APK and just specify the resource to load the bitmap. I think there's a number of other ways. You can actually pass a bitmap object if you want, so you could actually generate a marker image on the fly if you really wanted to. I think the other options, it's like a resource identifier. You can specify a bitmap object. You can specify a file. Yeah. So if you want to actually load the file out of storage.
Yeah, so typically for the file situation, you might want to download it from the web or something. But yeah, as much as possible, you want to use resource IDs because you can chuck them in your drawable directories and get the right scaled image for whatever DPI the device is running at that time.
Yeah, really, the primary use case I see for using a file or a bitmap, for that matter, is actually if you're doing something like overlaying images, for example, on your map. So there you're specifying, like, let's say this image is associated with this position on the map, so you could actually just load that up in load that from local storage or over the wire. So.
Cool.
As opposed to out of your resources directory. But if you're just reusing the same icon over and over again, definitely drop it in your resources directory. And so anchoring, because these you can specify. So I'm just going to go back to the last slide real quick. So the anchor on the default marker is actually the very bottom center of that red teardrop. So that's actually where the coordinates are when I specify. Well, in this case, it shows 0, 0, but that's definitely not San Francisco lat long. But so the lat long is actually associated with the bottom center of that teardrop, which is the pinpoint. So you can actually change that, however. So what I had done before, I wish I could show you, but you can create your own custom marker icon, and you can do things like put a drop shadow on it, or some you could have it like offset it a little bit to the right, so you can the pinpoint off a little bit to the left or right, so you can I don't know, just customize it to make it look a little more appealing for your application. If you do that, you have to set a new anchor point, and that's the very last method down in the anchoring section. So that's a percentage from top left.
Would a good use case for this be something like where your marker is like a pin, it's kind of angled, and so the center point of the marker isn't actually the point that touches the ground, and so if you'd set the position to be that marker, it would have put the center point rather than the bottom right corner if it was a pin, for example.
Exactly, yeah. Like I think the classic marker is actually the pin, and generally it's positioned so that the pin point is at the bottom left of the the bottom left of the image. Yeah. So in that case, you'd actually have to specify an anchor, and the anchor would be 0, 1, because you're 0% along the x-axis and 100% along the y-axis, because the origin is the top left of the image.
Yep.
So for the default marker, it's going to be 0.51 because it's the bottom center, or I'm sorry, the center bottom, and for the case where you have the push pin, it's going to be 0, 1.
Gotcha.
So just based in percentage points. And marker events. So I definitely should have covered map events, but maybe we can talk about those in another one. Marker events are actually really important because it's the way that users actually interact with your pinpoints or your markers on your map. So so by default, they're actually people can click, or users can actually touch the icons. If you have an info window, the default behavior is the info window is displayed. And users can actually touch the info window. So this would be the use cases. Let's say you're plotting, you don't want to show all the restaurants in a particular city. You can put markers on the map for all the restaurants. The user can press the marker to actually see the info window, which would be, let's say, the restaurant name. And then if the user touches the info window, that can take them to a details page. So that's kind of the rationale behind things like the marker, the on-marker click listener, because you know when the user clicked the marker, the on-window click listener, because you know when the user actually clicked the info window, and then marker drag, because like we showed before, users can actually move the marker around the map. There's also a marker drag listener as well. So the way that you actually set yourself up to receive these events is you define the listeners, any one of those 3, or all 3 if you want. You register your listeners. Once you've actually created your map, you can actually specify who your listeners are. In this case, the most easiest case is if you attach the listeners to your activity, and then when you create the map, just pass it a reference to your activity. And then once that's all set up, you can just you implement these methods in your activity or fragment, and you can start receiving these events and do fun and interesting stuff with them. So the drag end, and drag start are obviously associated with the marker drag listener, info window click, info window click listener, and on marker click is the on marker click listener. And for each of these, as you can see, you get the marker that was touched, clicked, dragged, or whatever else. So I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. So just so that you all know, today was a part 1 in the series of ADL plus shows that we're going to have about the Maps API. The next episode won't be this year. It'll be early next year, but we're going to go into some more of the what we consider more advanced topics like polylines and so on. But we've got some really cool stuff coming up in and around the API. So with that being said, let us move on to Q&A.
Anchor, we got a couple questions from Lyndon in the chat window, so maybe we can take a look at them.
Awesome. Welcome, Lyndon. And Andrew was on there for a while as well. Okay, so I'm just trying to. There's quite a lot of chatter here, so I'm just trying to see where the first question.
Let me read the first question to you guys. So the first question was, any chance we can access the frame buffer for Google Maps to grab a big map? Well, it was possible with Map View version 1, and of course it broke a feature I had just implemented with the old API. So that's the first question.
I don't believe it's possible right now to do it. This API does not allow you to grab the frame buffer, but it's something that I can take back to the team. Just out of interest, Lyndon, if you're still on, just what are your use cases? It'll just help us explain it better to the engineering team.
Yeah, okay.
I think Lyndon's a bit shy today. He's got his sharing an image. So it's an image that you're actually taking of your app, like a screenshot. Close to it. Okay, look, it's not there right now. Let me talk it over with the team. There may be a reason that we didn't do that, and we'll get back to you.
There is. One potential alternative is if you just want a snapshot of the map, there is the Google Maps static image API. So that's Hyper-User also doesn't do it. So if you should essentially get the exact same information back if you specify the bounding box for what you want to get from the static image API. So yeah, static maps is
Is
what
what I implemented for work on. Yeah, so for now you'll have to do that, but obviously that wouldn't cater for if you've got like custom markers and things like that. So if you're doing very Android-centric things.
Yeah, and there is so generally direct tile access, what we call it, or actually extracting the map information out to. I mean, we generally shun that. It actually violates our terms, which is why we have things like the static map API. But yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely worth talking with the engineering team and see what kind of use cases we can support around this, because definitely it is nice to share your maps.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. Tony, you want to just read them out for us?
Yeah, sure. The next question is it possible to overlay another OpenGL view that has transparent background on top of Google Map? Is that what Ingress is doing?
No, I think Ingress is doing something special. Yeah, so we can't talk about what Ingress is doing, but I think Ingress is doing something special. As to whether you can do that with this library, my gut feel is no, because I believe we render directly to the surface, and there will be some complications around that. So yeah, I'm pretty sure the answer is no, Lyndon.
Lyndon said we are enlightened.
Actually, I'm not. I'm on the resistance side. Okay. Was there any other questions from Lyndon? In the meanwhile, whilst he asks those questions, I'll just bring up some questions that Andrew asked before he left. He said, I haven't had a chance, so this is on the moderator page. I haven't had a chance to look at the new V2 maps, and I've been meaning to. I'm just waiting for a refresh. That was a bad time to hit refresh.
There we go.
But does this mean I don't have to use the user's library tag anymore? Does this also mean I don't need to use the Google API's checkbox in the Eclipse plugin to support Google Maps? So user's library, we no longer need that?
Yeah, so the process now is that you use the library project, so in Android. So, and that's the Google Play Services library project.
Yep.
And the
so for the checkbox, however, for the Google APIs, so when he says Eclipse plugin, I think what he's talking about is the AVD manager, the Android Virtual Device Manager. You definitely do need to use the Google API's image, because this is part of Google. Well, the Maps API is part of Google Play Services, which does rely on the Google API access. So that hasn't changed. Okay, that's all the questions on moderator. If anyone has any more questions, now's the time to ask them. Whilst we wait for that to happen, as I said, we'll be taking a couple of weeks off for ADL Plus, but we'll be coming back with our first episode back. We'll be focusing around some more of the capabilities of this API. And then in a future episode, we'll be talking about some really cool sort of recipes that you can do with the API. And we've got some sample apps to show off. Yeah, it's coming soon. So, well, I don't think there's anything more. So thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Love to talk about this stuff.
Yeah,
so.
we'll definitely try to have you on more often.
Awesome. My pleasure.
Thanks, Tony, for joining as well, and Lyndon as well. And Andrew for your question. And we will catch you next time or next year. Hope you all have a great and safe holiday and a happy New Year.
Happy holidays.